The recording begins mid-breath, as if the man speaking had been gathering himself for some time before he found the words to start. My name is Caleb Marin Voss. I was born in 1878 on the farm outside Elkhorn, Walworth County, Wisconsin. I am speaking this into the machine my daughter brought to the hospital, and I am told the date is February the 9th, 1959. I am telling this now because I have not told it before, not properly, not in full, and I am running out of occasions on which I might do so. The doctor says my heart is doing what old hearts do when they have been carrying weight for too long. I want to say first that I do not expect anyone who hears this to believe me. That is not why I am telling it. I am telling it because I left my brother locked in a building while something tore through the wall of our barn 40 yards away, and because I have not slept cleanly since November of 1902, and because there is a fence post sitting in the corner of that barn, the same barn that has been in my family for 50 years, with claw marks cut into the wood at a height of nearly 7 feet that no wolf, no bear, and no man on this earth could have put there. I have never shown it to anyone. I am describing it now so that when I am gone, whoever finds it will know what they are looking at. I will come back to the fence post, and I will come to what happened in the grain store. But I need to say those two things first, so that a person listening to this understands why I am speaking at all. I am not speaking for the record. I am speaking because silence has cost me enough. The winter of 1902 started the way winters in Walworth County always started, which is to say it arrived without apology. By the first week of November, the ground along Bray Road had frozen to the consistency of old iron, and the frost came up through the floorboards at night, hard enough that you could feel it in the soles of your feet, even through 2 pairs of wool socks. We burned through cordwood faster than we had anticipated. The corn had been middling that year, nothing ruinous but nothing to celebrate. And my father, Emery Voss, was in one of his careful moods, which meant he spoke less than usual and moved through the house in that deliberate way he had when he was calculating things in his head. He was 44 years old that winter, a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been formed by the farm itself rather than born onto him. He had been on that land since 1891, when he came up from Illinois with my mother and my older brother, Reeve, and staked the tenancy from a landholder named Pruitt, who owned a significant piece of the county and cared about it primarily in the abstract. Reeve was 22 in 1902. I was 24. Our younger brother, Thomas, was 16, and I want to be careful how I describe Thomas because I am going to have to describe what happened to him, and I want a person listening to understand who he was before any of this occurred. Thomas was the kind of boy who noticed things. He was the one who would tell you there was a hawk sitting on the fence line before you had turned your head to look. He could tell what the weather was going to do by the way the cattle moved in the morning. He was not bookish exactly, but he had a quality of attention that our father said was either going to make him a very good farmer or a very strange man, and our father meant that as a genuine compliment to the first possibility. Thomas was steady. He was not easily frightened. I say that plainly, and I mean it. And I say it because of what he became afterward, and because anyone who heard about him later, in the state institution, would have no reason to think he had ever been anything other than what he became. He had been something else entirely before the 5th of November, 1902. My mother, Eris Voss, born Eris Halm in Racine County, was a woman of 40 years who had survived 2 Wisconsin winters that killed cattle and one that killed a neighbor's family outright, and she had arrived at a form of practical calm that I can only describe as the opposite of helplessness. She did not pray loudly. She cooked, she mended, she kept the accounting ledgers in a handwriting so precise it looked printed, and she held the household together with a matter-of-fact efficiency that I have never seen equaled in any person since. When things went wrong on the farm, she was the one who assessed them first. My father made decisions, but my mother was the one who had already calculated the outcomes before he announced them. There was one other person involved in these events who I need to account for, and that is our nearest neighbor, a man named Hollis Prager, who farmed the 40 acres immediately to our north along the same road. Hollis was 51 years old. and had lived on that land his entire adult life, which meant he had been farming along Bray Road for 30 years before we arrived, and he knew the territory in a way that went beyond maps or survey lines. He knew which field flooded in March and which didn't, which tree line was genuinely sheltered from the northwest wind and which only looked it, and which parts of the county older farmers still refused to run livestock near after dark. I did not understand that last category of knowledge at the time. I understand it now. Hollis had told us, not once but several times across the years, that there were parts of the woodline south of our cornfield that the deer did not go into. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather, without drama. He said the local farmers, the ones who had been on the land before the settlement wave, called that section of timber the cold stand, not because of temperature, but because nothing moved through it, except in leaving. I am reporting this now because it is relevant, and because I did not take it seriously in 1902, and I have spent 57 years understanding that I should have. What I am going to tell you began on the evening of November the 2nd. Reeve had gone out to check on the cattle before supper. This was ordinary. He made that walk every evening before dark, circling the barn, checking the fence line along the south field, making sure the gate adjoined the lane was properly secured. He was gone longer than usual that evening, and when he came back into the kitchen, his face had an expression on it that I had not often seen on Reeve, which was a kind of held-back agitation, the look of a man deciding whether what he has seen is worth reporting. He told us that he had seen a wolf at the edge of the cornfield. A large one, he said, larger than any he had seen in the county before. He had been standing at the south fence when he noticed it, and at first he thought it was a dog that had wandered from somewhere. But then he saw the size of it and the way it moved, and he understood it for what it was. He said it had been standing at the margin of the corn stubble and the tree line, not moving, looking in his direction. He said it did not run when he shouted at it. It turned and went into the timber at a pace that was almost leisurely, and that bothered him more than the size. My father listened to this without changing expression, and then asked how large. Reeve said he could not be certain in the fading light, but that its back had been level with the fence rail, which on our south fence was 42 inches from the ground. A wolf, properly speaking, should not stand more than 30 inches at the shoulder in this part of the country. 42 inches is not a wolf. No one said that, however. We ate supper. The following evening, November the 3rd, Reeve went back out with his rifle. I say this plainly, because that is what happened. My father did not tell him to go. My father did not tell him not to go. There was a quality of unspoken permission in the household that evening that I have thought about many times since. That sense of a decision being made in the spaces between what people say. My father's position was, I believe, that we could not afford to lose livestock to a predator, and that a wolf bold enough to stand at a fence line in the early evening and not flee at a shout was a wolf that needed to be discouraged. That was the agricultural logic of it, and it was sound on its own terms. Reeve came back just before full dark. He said he had found the wolf at the same location, and that he had gotten a shot into it before it moved. He was certain he had hit it because he had seen it stumble. But it had gone into the cold stand, and the light was too far gone to follow it, and he had not recovered the carcass. He said the shot had gone into its left flank, well placed, and that no animal hit like that was going to travel far. My father nodded. 3 nights passed. I want to be specific about those 3 nights because they were not nothing. They were not simply quiet time before things changed. The cattle were uneasy on the night of November the 4th, the night after the shot, in a way that was noticeable but not alarming. Cattle shift and call at night sometimes, and you learn to read the register of it, the difference between ordinary restlessness and genuine distress. What I heard that first night was somewhere in the middle, a low, sustained agitation in the voices of the animals, rather than panic, and it resolved itself before midnight. I told myself the cold was settling in and tightening things. On November the 5th, the cattle were quiet, but the dogs were not right. We had 2 working dogs at that time, a bitch named Kara and her year-old son, who we called Gray on account of his coloring. Both dogs had been indifferent to weather and noise their whole lives, the kind of farm dogs that sleep through thunderstorms and regard strangers with professional skepticism rather than fear. On the 5th of November, they refused to go outside after dark. Kara sat at the kitchen door and vibrated. That is the word I would use. Not shaking, not whimpering, but vibrating, the way a tuning fork vibrates when you have just struck it. Gray pressed himself against the wall under the kitchen table and did not move until morning. I sat up late that night listening. My wife, Clara, who I have not mentioned and who was living in the house with us that winter, along with our infant daughter, asked me what I was listening for. I told her I was not sure. She had the sense not to press me further. The night was very still. There was no wind to speak of, which sometimes happens in that country in early November before the real winter weather rolls down from the north and takes permanent residence. Still nights in Wisconsin are not entirely silent. There is always some sound, the creak of frozen timber, the distant movement of a deer somewhere in the field, the occasional car or wagon on the road, the sound of the farm itself settling and adjusting. That night I sat by the kitchen window for perhaps 2 hours and heard almost nothing, and the almost nothing was the part that stayed in my chest like a stone. Then, at some point past midnight, I heard it for the first time. It was coming from the south, from the direction of the cold stand. A low sound, rhythmic, repeating. I can describe it only by saying it was the sound of something hard and blunt, being dragged across frozen ground at a slow, deliberate pace. Not continuous, but rhythmic. A scrape and then a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, and then a scrape again, slow enough that you could count between them. I counted. I sat at that kitchen window and I counted the interval. I do not know why I did that, except that it was the only thing that felt like a useful response to what I was hearing. 1, 2, scrape. 1, 2, scrape. 1, 2. It lasted for perhaps 10 minutes and then stopped. I did not wake anyone. I told myself it was a branch, some piece of deadfall, ice-weighted enough to drag itself across the ground in some manner I could not account for. I told myself these things with the particular conviction of a man who needs to sleep and is aware that there is work to do in the morning. I went back to bed. I lay in the dark for a long time. In the morning I went out before first light to begin the usual work, and I walked the south fence line with a lantern. I want to say clearly that I was not looking for evidence of anything in particular. I was doing what I normally did. I made myself do it normally, and I found nothing at the fence line itself, no tracks that I could read clearly in the frost, no sign of an animal in the field. But when I reached the point where the fence met the tree line, the point where Reeve had been standing on the nights he had seen and then shot the wolf, I noticed that the air coming out of the cold stand smelled different from the air around it. Not rotten, not like an animal carcass, which I had smelled before on the farm, and which is a very particular smell. It was something older and wilder than that, a wet earth smell cut through with something musky and animal, but not any animal I could name. It was cold, and it came out of the trees in a way that made me step back without deciding to. I finished my circuit and went in for breakfast and said nothing. That was November the 6th. On November the 7th, the sound returned. It came at roughly the same time, past midnight, and this time I was already awake and already at the window before it properly started. I had been sleeping lightly for 2 nights, and I think some part of me had been listening even while I slept. The sound was the same in its character, that low, rhythmic scraping across frozen ground, but it was closer. That was the thing I could not avoid understanding. On the 5th, it had seemed to come from the tree line itself, from the margin of the cold stand where it met the south field. On the 7th, it was coming from somewhere in the field. It had moved. The distance between the tree line and the barn was perhaps 200 yards, and the sound on the 7th night was coming from what I estimated, by listening and by trying to remember the geography of that field in the dark, was somewhere around 150 yards out. I went and woke my father. He sat in the kitchen in his nightshirt and listened for some time without speaking. I watched his face in the low light of the lamp I had brought in from the hall. He was the kind of man who did not register emotion easily on his face, but I knew his face the way you know a piece of country you have walked for years, and what I saw there was not dismissal. It was recognition, as if he was hearing something that confirmed a thought he had been suppressing. He told me to go back to bed. "This farm is still ours," he said. "Go back to bed." I am reporting that as a direct quotation because I remember it exactly, and because it tells you everything about where my father was in his thinking at that moment. He was not denying what he heard. He was asserting ownership against it. He was staking a claim against a sound in the dark, the way he would have staked it against a creditor or a hostile neighbor, by placing himself firmly in possession. That was Emery Voss, and I went back to bed. The morning of November the 8th, I went out with my father and Reeve, and we walked the south field together. I had not told Reeve about the sound. My father had not told Reeve. We walked out there in the early grey light without stating why, which was a Voss family trait, and within 10 minutes, Reeve found the marks. The ground in the field was frozen solid, but the frost layer on top was thin enough in places to record a disturbance. What we found was a line of marks running from the direction of the tree line toward the barn, spaced roughly 2 feet apart, each one a deep scraping gouge in the frost crust, about 6 inches wide and perhaps an inch deep. They were not footprints. They were not the kind of track any animal of my experience left. Not cloven, not padded, not clawed in any arrangement I recognized. They were gouges, as if something had been dragging the knuckles of a very large hand across the ground with each step. The marks ran in a straight, deliberate line for approximately 50 yards into the field from the tree line, and then stopped, as if whatever made them had halted, stood for a time, and then returned. We could not find return marks, which I have thought about since. The ground may not have been uniform enough to record them clearly in all places. I prefer that explanation. Reeve crouched over the marks for a long time without speaking. Then he said that he had seen wolves drag their legs in certain gaits, especially if injured. My father said nothing. I looked at the spacing of the marks, and the depth of them, and I thought about the interval I had been counting from the kitchen window. 1, 2, scrape, 1, 2, scrape, and I thought about how that interval had never varied, never quickened, never slowed, and I could not match that quality of rhythm to any animal I knew. A wounded animal does not move with that kind of measured regularity. A wounded animal favors and stumbles, and its pace reflects its pain. Whatever made those marks was moving at a speed and with a precision that had nothing to do with injury. None of us said any of this. We went back to the barn and began the morning work. I need to tell you about that day, November the 8th, because it was the day things changed in the house. The day the scraping marks were found. The day the argument between my father and Reeve properly began. The day my mother started sleeping with a lamp on. And the day Thomas told me something I did not know what to do with. Thomas came to find me in the afternoon while I was splitting wood behind the barn. He was a deliberate boy, and he did not say unnecessary things. So when he stood beside me, without speaking for a moment, I understood he was arranging his words carefully. He told me that for the past 3 nights he had been waking before the sound started. He did not know how he was waking. He would simply find himself sitting up in his bunk bed, fully alert, in complete silence, and then after perhaps 2 or 3 minutes the scraping would begin. He said it felt less like being woken by the sound and more like being woken in advance of it. I looked at him. He was 16 and he looked perfectly steady, and that steadiness was the part that got to me, because a boy reporting imaginary fears looks one way, and a boy reporting a fact he finds troubling looks another way entirely, and Thomas looked the second way. I told him to tell Father. He said he already had, and that Father had told him to keep himself occupied and to stop listening. I told Thomas to do what Father said. He nodded and went back inside. I finished splitting the wood and stood in the cold for a while after. The afternoon light was going. South of the barn, the tree line of the cold stand was a dark smear against the grey sky, and I stood looking at it for longer than I should have, because I had a feeling, Not a premonition exactly, more like an awareness, that whatever was in those trees was also looking back. That was the evening I found the fence post. I was making my circuit of the south fence before full dark, same as every evening, and I came to the section of fence nearest the tree line, and there was a gap in the posts. One of the posts was gone. We had built that fence with posts, sunk 2 feet into the ground, packed hard, the way you do when you want a fence to last. A post that size, sunk that deep, does not pull free on its own. You cannot pull it free with your hands. You would need a team of horses and a chain, or a very large iron tool, and even then, the effort would be considerable, and the ground around the hole would show the signs of it. The ground around the hole showed no signs of that kind of effort. The earth at the rim of the hole was cracked and disturbed, but not churned, not pulled apart by equipment, just broken at the edges the way soil breaks when something has simply been yanked out of it by force. The hole was still there, clean and dark, 2 feet deep. The post itself was lying in the field. I found it 60 yards from its hole, in the direction away from the tree line, as if it had been carried or thrown outward toward the barn rather than back into the timber. It was a substantial piece of worked oak, a 7-foot post, and it weighed perhaps 40 pounds. I walked to it and stood over it, and I had the peculiar sensation of understanding something without wanting to understand it. Then I crouched, and I looked at it more closely. Along the length of the post, beginning at what had been the top, near the ground line, and running down the exposed section, there were gouges cut into the grain of the wood. Not scratches, not the marks an animal leaves when it rubs against a post or chews at it. Cuts. Deep cuts, the kind you make with a chisel, except that a chisel leaves a flat-bottomed groove, and these were curved, like the arc of a very large claw, 3 of them running parallel, spaced 1.5 inches apart, and they began at a height that I measured by standing beside the post and looking at where they started along its length. The gouges began at very close to 7 feet from where the base of the post had been, which was the portion still exposed when the post had been set in the ground. 7 feet up a fence post. I stood in that field for a long time. I did not call for anyone. I did not shout. I picked up the post and carried it back to the barn and laid it in the far corner behind the old feed chests, and I leaned it against the wall and I stood looking at it for a while. There was a quality to those marks that I found difficult to reason against. They were too deliberate. They were too high. Whatever had made them had put them there on purpose, the way you mark a boundary, the way you sign a territory. That was the thought I had, and I did not want the thought, and I could not get rid of it. I left the post in the barn and went in for supper. That night at the table I told my father about the fence post. I described it plainly, and he listened the same way. Reeve was at the table and he listened too, and I watched both their faces, and what I saw in them was not the same thing. My father's face went carefully still in the way it did when he was working out the implications of something. Reeve's face went in a different direction, a focused, hard look. The look of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and who has just received confirmation that he was right to think about it. My mother said nothing. She ate her supper and refilled the lamp on the table, and she said nothing for a long time. And then she said, "How far is it coming each night?" That question stopped everyone. It was the right question. It was the question none of us had wanted to state directly, because stating it out loud meant acknowledging the logic of the progression, that it was measurable, that it was consistent, that it was not random animal behavior, but a deliberate and calibrated approach. My mother had stated it anyway, because she was who she was. I said that I estimated it had moved from the tree line to roughly the midpoint of the south field in 2 nights, possibly 150 yards in 2 advances. My mother looked at the middle of the table and said nothing more for the remainder of the meal. The argument began after supper when Thomas and Clara had gone upstairs. Reeve's position was that we needed to arm ourselves and go out and find it. He said he had hit it with a solid shot, and it had come back, and that this told you something about what kind of animal it was, which was the kind that required a second shot to finish what the first had started. He said the fence post was a provocation, and that you do not answer a provocation by retreating from it. He said we had a lease on this land and an obligation to it, and that letting an animal drive us off would destroy everything the family had worked for since coming to Walworth County. My father's position was different. My father said that the wounded animal had come back. He emphasized that. He had been shot, he said, and he had come back. He said that an animal that comes back after being shot is not behaving like an animal. He said this plainly, as a factual observation, and then he said that a man who shoots an animal without killing it has made an enemy of it, and that pursuing an enemy who was already showing you what it was capable of was not bravery, it was vanity. He said that the fence post and the marks on it told him they needed to leave. Not permanently, long enough for whatever this was to understand that the debt had been settled. Reeve said that there was no debt. He said he was not going to accept the idea that shooting a wolf on his own fence line had created any obligation to anything. He said the farm did not belong to the wolf. My father said the wolf did not come back to claim the farm. It came back to show us what it is. I have carried that sentence for 57 years. I do not know entirely what my father meant by it, but I know that he was right. I did not speak much during that argument. I was 24 years old, and I understood that my father and my brother were both correct in their own terms, and that this was the worst kind of disagreement, the kind where neither side is being unreasonable, and there is no ground in the middle that solves anything. Reeve was right that retreat would cost us something real and practical. My father was right that we had provoked something that was showing us, in increasing detail, what provoking it had cost. I sat at the kitchen table and I listened to them, and I thought about the interval between the scraping sounds. 1, 2, scrape. And I thought about how it had advanced each night by a distance I could measure. And I thought about the marks beginning at 7 feet on a post that no man could reach without a ladder. The argument ended without resolution. My father went to bed. Reeve sat at the table for a time, and then went to bed. I stayed up. The sound came that night at its usual hour. Past midnight, the house deeply quiet, the dogs motionless and pressed against the floor, not even the cattle moving in the barn. I was at the kitchen window already. The sound was clearer now, closer, and I could hear in it something I had not been able to hear at greater distance. A slight variation in the scrape itself, a quality to it, as if the surface being dragged across the ground was not uniformly smooth, not a stick or a flat stone, but irregular, textured, jointed. The closest thing I can compare it to is the sound a very large hand makes when you drag the backs of your fingers, the knuckle side, across a wooden floor with deliberate, even pressure. That sound, amplified, slowed, repeated at a cadence that never varied. I estimated it was coming from somewhere between 75 and 100 yards south of the barn. I sat with that estimate in the dark kitchen for the remainder of the night. In the morning of November the 9th, I will tell you what else I found, because there is more to account for before we reach the night of the 5th, and I want a person listening to understand how the days moved, how each discovery built on the one before, how we arrived where we arrived by a series of steps that each seemed almost manageable until suddenly none of them were. There was no argument on November the 9th. My father and Reeve had reached one of their silences, the kind where neither man speaks, because speaking means resuming a dispute that has not been resolved, and both men know it. They moved through the morning work in separate orbits. I worked with Thomas, and Thomas was, as I said, steady and attentive, but he had circles under his eyes, and I knew he had spent another night waking before the sound, and then lying in the dark listening to it advance. Clara came to me that morning and told me that she thought we should go. I want to be honest about this. Clara was not a timid woman. She had grown up on a farm in Rock County, and she had seen difficult things, and she was not given to alarm without cause. She said it quietly, away from the others, and she said it with a directness that had nothing fearful in it, just a clear-eyed assessment. She said that the dogs were not eating, and that the cattle's milk production had dropped by nearly half in 3 days, and that these were objective facts about what the farm animals were experiencing, and that farm animals in her experience did not behave this way without a substantial reason. She said that whatever was in the cold stand had put those marks on the fence post at 7 feet, and that she wanted to know what I intended to do about that. I told her my father was thinking on it. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "I know what your father is thinking. I need to know what you are thinking." I did not have an answer for her. I think about that conversation more than I would like to admit. That afternoon, the second dog, Bray, refused to go outside at all. He sat under the kitchen table from mid-afternoon onward and did not move except to press himself against the floor when any exterior sound was audible. Kara sat at the kitchen door and was silent, but her silence had a texture to it, a stretched, alert quality, as if she was a string tuned too tight and was waiting to either sound or break. I went out in the mid-afternoon to check on the livestock. The cattle were in a reduced state. Quiet, but with that hollow, staring quality that cattle sometimes get when they have been under sustained stress, their eyes wide and fixed on the south wall of the barn. All of them were oriented the same direction. I have worked with cattle my entire life, and I know that they are not complicated animals, that they respond to simple signals, temperature, noise, smell, the presence of a predator. But to see 12 animals standing in the same orientation, all of them turned toward the same wall, all of them silent in that deep, compressed way, was not something I had seen before. I stood in the barn and I listened. Nothing, during the daylight hours. But the smell was there. That wet earth, musky, animal smell I had first encountered at the tree line. It was faint, carried into the barn by some draft I could not locate, and it was the kind of smell that sits at the back of your throat rather than the front of your nose, deep and old, and entirely outside my experience of Wisconsin farm country. I spent several minutes trying to locate where it was coming from, and could not. It was simply present, in the air of the barn, as if it had been breathed in. I went back to the house. That evening was the last quiet evening we had, if quiet is the right word for a household under the kind of tension that ours was under by November the 9th. My mother cooked a proper supper, and we all sat at the table, all 6 of us. My parents, Reeve, Thomas, Clara, and I, and we ate without speaking very much. My daughter was asleep upstairs. The lamp was bright. There is something about a bright lamp in a farm kitchen in November in Wisconsin that I cannot fully describe without it sounding sentimental, but the warmth of it, the light of it, the enclosed safety of it, was very vivid to me that evening. I was aware of it in a way I had not been on ordinary evenings. I was aware that we were all together at the table, and that this was a thing worth noticing. After supper, my father spoke. He said that he had been thinking, and that he believed they needed to settle this between themselves tonight, that another night of not deciding was itself a decision, and not a good one. He looked at Reeve when he said this. Reeve's jaw tightened, but he did not speak immediately. My father said that what was in the cold stand was not a wolf. He said this carefully, taking the words apart and putting them down one at a time. He said he was not saying what it was, because he did not know what it was, but he was saying what it was not. He said the fence post and the marks on it were not made by any wolf, any bear, or any other animal he had knowledge of. And he said the pattern of advance, the nightly progress measured in yards, was not an animal pattern. It was something else, and he said that the shot Reeve had put into it on the 3rd of November had not discouraged it. It had begun this advance on the night after the shot. Reeve said that this was a reason to finish it, not to flee from it. My father said, "What we shot did not die. Now it is showing us what it can do, before it decides what to do next. That is not an animal. You do not shoot your way out of a reckoning." Reeve looked at the table. He was not, as I have said, an unreasonable man, and I could see that my father's words were working on him, but he had too much of himself invested in the position he had taken, because the position was not really about the creature, it was about the farm, about the 11 years of labor that had gone into that land, about the idea that retreat was the same as surrender, and that surrender was the thing our family could not afford. He said that if we left, Pruett's people would hear of it, and there would be questions about whether we intended to return, and that a tenant who abandoned a leasehold was a tenant at risk of losing it. He said this practically, financially, without emotion, and it was, again, a true thing. That was the position Reeve was defending. Not courage in the abstract, but the family's standing and the farm's future. I want to be fair to him. I want whoever hears this to understand that Reeve's argument was not stupidity or machismo. He was protecting something real. My father sat with that for a time, and then he said they would spend the night of November the 10th, armed and watching from the barn, he and Reeve together, and they would see what came. He said this as a compromise, acknowledging what Reeve needed while preserving the option to leave if the night's watch confirmed what he already believed. Reeve accepted this. It was not what either of them wanted, but it was what they could agree to. My mother said nothing during this conversation. She cleared the supper dishes. I watched her move around the kitchen with that efficient precision of hers, and I saw, in the set of her shoulders, an opinion she had decided not to voice. I knew her well enough to know what the opinion was, and I was old enough to know that she had made a calculation, that to voice it would break the agreement my father and brother had reached, and that a broken agreement was worse than a flawed one. That night, the 9th, the sound came again. I was at the window. Reeve came down and stood behind me without saying anything, and we both listened. The sound was closer, materially closer, and this time I could hear, in addition to the rhythmic scraping, something else beneath it. A deeper sound, more felt than heard. A low, sustained resonance, like the note at the bottom of an organ pipe, cycling with the rhythm of the scraping, as if the thing moving across that field was doing so with a kind of sustained, slow exhalation. It lasted longer than the previous nights, perhaps 20 minutes before it stopped. When it stopped, Reeve went back to bed. I sat at the window for a long time after. The night was perfectly still and absolutely dark, no moon, and the south field was invisible beyond the barn. But I had the sense, sitting at that window, of being observed from the darkness, not the vague, atmospheric sense that people sometimes describe in wild places. A specific sense, an awareness of attention directed at the window where I was sitting, from out there in the dark field. I cannot account for this sensation by any rational means, and I am not going to try. I am reporting it because it is part of what happened. I went to bed before dawn. November the 10th was the day before everything ended. My father and Reeve spent the morning preparing the barn for the watch that night. They reinforced the interior latch of the main door, which was a stout oak bar already, but my father wanted iron brackets spiked into the frame to prevent the bar from being forced upward from outside. He had looked at the fence post by this point, which I had shown him the previous morning, and the iron brackets were a response to the marks on it. He was not a man who spoke about fear, but he communicated it through his actions, and the iron brackets were his way of saying that he was taking the height and force of those marks seriously. Reeve checked both rifles and the shotgun, cleaned them, loaded them, and set them against the barn wall where they could be reached quickly. I asked him what he intended to do if something came to the barn door. He said he intended to shoot it. I asked him what he would do if that did not work, as it had not worked on the second. He gave me a look that was more complicated than his usual directness, a look that acknowledged the question without wanting to answer it, and said that a shot from 20 yards was a different proposition than a shot across a darkened field. Thomas spent the day in his usual work, but with a quality of withdrawal I had not seen in him before. He was present. He completed what was asked of him, but he was somewhere else inside himself, listening for something that was not yet audible. At one point in the afternoon, I found him standing at the south end of the barn, facing the wall that fronted toward the field, his hand pressed flat against the planking. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there with his hand against the wood. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was trying to feel whether it was already close. I told him to come inside. He came. Clara spent that day packing a bag. She did it quietly, upstairs, and she did not tell me she was doing it, and I did not ask. We had reached a kind of agreement between us that did not require words, a mutual recognition that the night of the 10th was going to tell us something, one way or the other, and that we should be prepared for what the answer might be. I went out one more time in the afternoon to look at the south field, to look at the ground between the barn and the tree line, to see if the morning had left anything legible in the frost. What I found stopped me where I stood. The line of scraping marks in the frost ran from the tree line to a point approximately 30 yards from the barn wall. 30 yards. Not 75, not 100, not the 150 of 3 nights ago. 30 yards from the barn wall, the marks stopped, and at the place where they stopped, there was a disturbance in the frost that was different from the rest of the marks, a wider area, as if something had turned or pivoted or stood for a time in one place. The frost around this wider disturbance was compressed, packed down as if under considerable weight. I knelt in the field, and I looked at the edge of the compressed area, and I found a print. It was not a wolf print. It was not a bear print, which I had seen before on other occasions, and which I would have recognized. It was elongated, longer than it was wide, and at its forward edge there were 3 deep depressions that I understood to be the tips of claws or toes, or some forward-facing digits of a thing standing more upright than any animal I knew. The print was large enough that I could have placed my 2 hands inside it side by side, with room left over on all edges. The depth of it in the frost, the compression of it, told me something about the weight that had made it, and the weight it told me about was not the weight of any wolf. I stood up. I walked back to the barn. I went to the corner where I had put the fence post, and I looked at those marks again, the 3 parallel curved cuts starting at 7 feet, and I put together the print in the field and the height of the marks, and I understood, with a clarity that I can only describe as cold, what kind of thing had been advancing on our farm each night for 4 nights. It was not moving on 4 legs. Something moving on 4 legs does not stand 7 feet high at a post. It was moving on 2 legs, like a man, but it was not a man, because a man does not have a stride that leaves knuckle drag marks in the frost, does not leave a footprint the size of 2 human hands, does not claw a fence post at 7 feet while standing at ground level. I went back to the house. I told my father what I had found. My father stood in the kitchen for a long time and said nothing. Then he said, "Where is Reeve?" Reeve was in the barn. My father went to the barn and spoke with him privately. I do not know what was said in that conversation. I know that when my father came back into the house, he told my mother to have us ready to leave before dawn the following morning. He said this without heat or drama, just the flat instruction of a man who has made a decision. My mother nodded and said nothing, as if she had been waiting for it, as if the time between this moment and the moment she had formed this opinion herself had simply been the time required for the men in the household to arrive at the same place. Reeve came back into the house at supper. He had accepted the decision, I could see that. He was not happy about it. There was a quality to his silence during that meal that was not my father's considering silence. It was a younger and more brittle silence. The silence of a man compressing something that was still pressurized. He ate his supper, and he did not look at anyone directly, and when Thomas asked him a question about the following day, he answered it briefly and cleanly and went back to his plate. We would leave before dawn. My father and Reeve would watch the barn through the night, and we would hitch the wagon and go. That was the plan. I want to stop here and speak about the watch in the barn, because I need to be accurate about what my father and Reeve experienced that night, the 10th of November, before the full events of the 5th night's advance. I know what they experienced because my father told me the following day, and because what he told me is consistent in every detail with what I heard from inside the house. They had been in the barn since sundown. The horses were frightened, the cattle were worse than the night before, oriented again toward the south wall, and from the beginning of the watch the barn had that smell, the deep, wet earth animal musk I have described, stronger than it had been during the day. My father described it as filling the barn the way cold fills a room when you open a door, a presence in the air rather than a trace. The lantern they had hung showed him that the cattle had their eyes open and fixed, and their muscles were rigid under their hides. not trembling but locked, the way an animal locks when it has nowhere to run. The sound began sometime after midnight. My father said it began inside the tree line, at its original distance, and then advanced rapidly, not gradually as it had on the previous nights. In 3 progressions, it was at the south wall, not the previous night's 30 yards, but at the wall itself, because the sound on the 10th night did not scrape across the field. It was at the wall, directly against the planking of the barn's south side, and my father said it was not a sound that resembled dragging across ground anymore, but dragging across wood, a slow rhythmic scraping along the outside surface of the barn planking, as if something was running its knuckles along the wall from the outside, feeling it, testing it, learning its structure. Reeve raised the rifle. My father put his hand on the barrel and pushed it down. He told me this. He said he pushed the rifle down because they had already tried that, and because what was on the other side of that wall was not going to be stopped by it, and because shooting through a barn wall in the dark was more likely to punch a hole than to end anything, and because punching a hole was not something he wanted to do. The scraping moved along the wall. It went from the south face to the east corner, and then partway along the east face, and then returned to the south face and stopped. Then there was a silence that my father described as absolute. No cattle movement, no horse shifting, no sound from outside. The smell was at its strongest. He said he could feel it in the back of his throat, on his tongue, a taste as much as a smell. And then the south wall moved. Not the door at all, the south wall itself. My father said that 3 planks in the middle section of the south wall, which were standard board planking spiked to a frame, deflected inward under a sustained pressure from outside, and that the spikes holding one of the planks to the frame pulled out of the wood with a sound he compared to a large nail being drawn from green lumber, a deep, reluctant creak, and then a pop. The plank bowed inward, held at top and bottom but pulled free from its center fastening, and in the gap thus created, in the absolute dark outside the barn wall, my father saw an eye. He described it to me the following day, in the kitchen of our neighbor Hollis Prager's house, where we had taken refuge after the flight, and he described it with the same flatness he brought to most things. He said the eye was large, that the glow from the barn lantern reflected in it the way lantern light reflects in the eye of a very large animal, but that the reflective quality of it was different from any animal's eye he had seen before. Not the tapetum brightness of a deer or a cat or a dog, but something deeper and more considered, an amber color, lit from within rather than reflecting from without, and it was looking directly at him, not scanning, not moving, looking at him specifically. He did not shoot. He met its gaze for a period of time that he was unable to estimate. He said it felt both instantaneous and very long, and then the plank was released, and the wall moved back, and the sound of its knuckles on the planking resumed, slower now, moving back toward the south corner, crossing the south face of the barn, moving in the direction of the east field, and then the scraping changed quality again, softer, across ground, retreating toward the tree line, until it was gone. My father came back into the house before first light, and he woke us all. He said one thing. He said, "It saw me. We are going." That was November the 11th, before dawn. And here is where I have to tell you what happened, that I cannot forgive myself for. The plan had been to hitch the wagon in the dark, and leave with the family and the most essential things we could load quickly. We had most of this prepared the night before. The bags were near the door, the wagon was in the barn, and we were to move through the morning work of hitching with as little noise and delay as possible. My father wanted to be on the road before full light. We were doing this. We were doing exactly this, moving through the dark kitchen, gathering the bags, and Clara had the baby bundled and I had my bag and my father's bag, and we were going to the barn to start hitching, when my father turned to me and said that Thomas needed to be put somewhere safe while they worked the horses in the dark, because a startled horse in a dark barn could kill a boy who got in the way, and that the grain store was the right place. It was a solid building. It had a latch that could be secured from outside. Thomas could wait there for 10 minutes while we got the horses hitched and the wagon out, and then we would open the latch and Thomas would climb up onto the wagon and we would go. I want to account for this exactly because I need a person listening to understand the sequence of it. The grain store was a small, separate structure adjacent to the east side of the barn. It was built of thick planking, better built than the barn in some ways because it needed to be rodent-resistant, and it had a solid door with an outside latch and a small knothole at about eye level for a standing man, or for a boy of 16 who was tall for his age. My father put Thomas in the grain store because it was the most solid enclosed space on the property that was not the barn itself, and because Thomas, in the grain store, would not be underfoot in the dark barn while 2 frightened horses were being hitched in a hurry. Thomas went without argument. I saw my father close the latch. I was standing there. I was present for this. I want to be clear about that. What happened next happened quickly and in the wrong order, and I am going to tell you precisely how it went wrong, because this is the center of it. This is what I am speaking this recording into this machine to say. We went into the barn. The horses were in a state I had not seen them in before, standing against the far wall, pressed together, their ears laid back, their breathing loud and quick. They were not going to be easily hitched, and my father and Reeve went to them while I moved to get the wagon traces. It was in those first 2 minutes of working with the horses, 2 men handling 2 very frightened animals in a dark barn, that the sound began again. It was not midnight. It was not yet dawn. It was perhaps 4:30 in the morning, and the sound was already at the south wall, not approaching from the tree line, not advancing across the field by stages, but at the wall, immediately, as if it had not left, as if it had been waiting at the wall all along, and had simply resumed from where my father had last heard it withdraw, or had not withdrawn at all. I do not know. I have never known. The horses broke. There is no other way to put it. They broke all at once, both of them simultaneously, in a manner that is not the normal way of horse panic, which is usually sequential, one animal going first and the other following, but both together, as if the signal they received was identical and arrived at the same instant, and the noise they made was not the noise of frightened horses in a familiar space. It was the noise of animals that believed they were about to die. My father shouted to leave them. He shouted to get to the wagon. We had one horse already partially in trace, and she would have to do, and my father and Reeve got her hitched in a speed I would not have believed possible if I had not been there. 2 minutes of absolute concentrated effort, while the other horse hammered the back wall of his stall, and the south wall of the barn was sounding with the scraping and the low resonance, and the smell was everywhere, and the cattle were making a sound I have no adequate word for, a sound between a low and a scream, sustained, monotonous, terrible. We got the horse hitched. We got the wagon out of the barn through the main doors, into the yard, and my father was on the box, and Reeve was on the box, and Clara was on the seat with the baby, and I was at the horse's head guiding her out, and across the yard toward the lane, and I heard Thomas call out from the grain store. He called once, just my name, Caleb, and then he called my father's name, and then he called again, just a sound, not a word, a young man's voice asking for the latch to be opened from the outside. I turned to look. The grain store was 25 yards from where I stood at the horse's head. The yard between us was dark. The south wall of the barn was at my right, and the sound was against it. My father said, "Get up." I need you to understand what that meant. He said it once. He did not say it angrily. He said it with a terrible practicality. He had calculated the time it would take me to cross the yard to the grain store latch, open it, get Thomas out, get back across the yard, and get up onto the wagon, and he had calculated it against whatever was at the south wall of the barn, and he had made a decision. I said Thomas's name. I said it once, back into the dark yard. My father said, "Now, Caleb." I got up onto the wagon. I have said that, and I will not unsay it. I got up onto the wagon, and my father shook the reins, and we went down the lane toward Bray Road, at a pace that was too fast for safety, on a frozen lane in the dark. and Thomas's voice stopped as we cleared the property line, and I do not know whether it stopped because we were too far away to hear it, or because of some other reason, and the not knowing is something I have carried in the center of my chest for 57 years. We went to Hollis Prager's farm. It was 3 miles north on the road, and we arrived before full light, and my father knocked on Hollis's door, and Hollis took us in without asking for an explanation, which tells you something about Hollis, that he had the sense to see what state we were in, and to defer the questions for later. He fed us, and he gave the baby warm milk, and he sat across the table from my father, and did not say a single word of the variety "I told you so," which was the phrase most available to him, and which he chose not to use. Hollis listened, and at the end he said, "The cold stand has had that thing in it for longer than I have been on this road." He said it without surprise, simply as a piece of information. He said the old farmers called it the walker, not because it walked, but because it made rounds, the way a watchman makes rounds of a building, circling a territory at a measured pace to register its presence and its claim. He said the farmers who had been on the land before the settlement wave had known that Pruitt's South Field, the field adjacent to the cold stand, was territory the walker considered its own approach, and that the rule, the understanding, was that you did not go into the cold stand and you did not interfere with anything that came out of it. He said this rule had been maintained for many years by the simple expedient of no one being naive enough to do otherwise. He looked at my father when he said that. My father looked at the table. Then Hollis said, "Your boy is still on the property." He said it without drama, just placing the fact in front of us. He said he would ride out with me and we would get him. We rode out on the morning of the 11th, Hollis and I, in daylight, which Hollis said was the only sensible time to be near that property for the foreseeable future. He had a Sharps rifle that he had carried for 30 years, and he brought it, not because he believed it would be relevant, but because, as he said, bringing it cost nothing. The farm looked undisturbed in the morning light. The lane, the yard, the house, the barn, all standing, no damage visible from outside. The main barn doors were open, where we had pushed them going out, and had not pulled them shut behind us. One of the pigs had gotten out of its enclosure and was in the yard. The scene had that dislocated quality of a place abandoned in a hurry, ordinary objects in slightly wrong positions, a bucket tipped over, a rope coil on the ground where it did not belong. We went to the grain store. The latch was closed, as my father had left it. I opened it. Thomas was inside, in the far corner, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up. He was alive. He was unharmed in body. No marks on him, no injuries. He was looking at the knothole in the door, which at standing height for a boy of 16 would have been approximately eye level, and he was looking at it with the expression that I am going to try to describe accurately, even though I have been trying to find the right words for it for 57 years. It was not fear. Fear has a quality of agitation to it, a quality of forward edge, of the body preparing for response. What Thomas had on his face was the opposite of that. It was the expression of a person from whom something has been removed. Stillness, yes, but not the stillness of calm, the stillness of an absence, as if the part of him that connected outward to the world had been turned off or taken away. He was looking at the knothole the way a man looks at a window when there is no longer anything outside worth looking at. He turned when I said his name. He recognized me. He came with me to the horses without being urged. He did not speak on the ride back to Prager's farm. He did not speak at dinner. He spoke a little in the following days, enough that we believed the shock would pass, but it did not pass. And over the following months it became clear that something in the manner of Thomas before the 5th of November, that quality of calm, observant connection to the world around him, was gone. He became a man who flinched at sounds, who could not sustain attention on any practical task, who needed more and more care as the years advanced, until by 1910 it was clear that he could not live independently, and by 1915 he was in the care of the state, and he died in 1931 in an institution in Oshkosh, having never, to my knowledge, described to anyone what he had seen through the knothole of the grain store door during the 2 days we left him on that farm. I have spent a great deal of my life thinking about what he saw. I have reached no conclusion. The property still stood when we returned to it. The barn planking on the south wall had 3 boards pulled from their fastenings, 2 of them loose and 1 pulled entirely free and lying in the straw, which was how the creature had come through on the night of the 10th, or tried to come through, or had come through partially to look at my father before returning. The cattle were all alive. The horse that had not been hitched was alive and present in his stall, though he was never quite the same horse afterward, prone to shying and to fits of standing immobile in the field with his head up and his nostrils working. The livestock were all there. But the grain store had a knothole, and whatever came into that yard during the day and night that Thomas was inside the grain store had presumably been visible through the knothole at some point during those 48 hours. And whatever it was that was visible was the thing that removed the forward-facing quality from my brother's attention and never returned it. I will not speculate further on that. I cannot afford to. We returned to the farm in early December of 1902. My father negotiated with Pruett's office for an extended credit on the tenancy payment, citing hardship, and Pruett's office accepted without pressing for details, which I think says something about what other tenants along that stretch of road may have reported over the years, and what Pruett's office had learned to accept without inquiry. We came back to the farm because we needed the farm, because Reeve had been right that leaving would cost us materially, and because whatever had occupied the cold stand appeared to have made its point and had no further business with us, at least for that season. The south field was not worked for 2 years. My father did not fence the gap where the post had been pulled. He replaced the broken planking in the barn. He did not speak about the events of November directly or at any length. He lived on that farm until he died in 1919, and in all those years, he never, to my knowledge, told anyone outside the household what had happened. Hollis Prager did not speak of it either, as far as I know. The thing was not discussed. It was absorbed into the farm the way a difficult year is absorbed, folded into the continuing work of the place, referenced only in the way the behavior of animals sometimes changes permanently after a severe fright. In the new fence line my father built, 30 yards further from the cold stand than the old one, in the fact that the south field was planted in a pattern that kept human activity at its northern end and left the area nearest the timber untouched. The fence post is still in the barn. I should say, the barn still stands, and the farm passed out of Voss family ownership in 1947, after my wife died, and I could no longer work it alone. But I still own the barn as a separate structure, on a parcel Reeve bought back from Pruett's estate in 1930, and I have been to the barn twice in the last 5 years, once with my son-in-law and once alone, and both times the post was where I left it in 1902, behind the feed chests in the northeast corner. The marks on it are as they were. Wood does not change much in a cold, dry barn. The claw marks in the oak grain at nearly 7 feet are as clear as the day I carried the post in from the south field. My daughter asked me, when she brought the recording machine, whether I wanted her to stay in the room while I spoke. I told her no. Some of this she knows in pieces but not in full, and there is no reason for her to carry the full weight of it. She is a good woman. She has her mother's practical quality. She deserves to come into possession of this information in the way I am giving it to her, in a form she can set down when she has heard enough. I have not been back to the south field. I have not been back to the tree line of the cold stand. I have driven past that stretch of Bray Road a number of times in the years since, and I have not stopped the car. There is a particular quality to that section of road at dusk. A quality I cannot account for rationally, but that I have observed consistently across many decades, that the light in that area falls differently than it falls 50 yards in either direction, a slightly lower quality to it, a slightly reduced warmth, as if the road at that point is running through the edge of something that has a different relationship to afternoon light than the surrounding country does. I have never mentioned this observation to anyone. I do not know what it was. I have read, over the years, accounts of things described by various names by various people in various traditions, and some of these accounts contain details that match what we experienced: the upright gait, The size, the intelligence of the advance, the deliberate quality of the communication, because that is what the fence post was, communication. It was a statement, made in a vocabulary of force and elevation, about the nature of the thing that made it, and about the consequence of drawing its blood. Other accounts describe details that do not match at all. I have been unable to arrive at a name that satisfies me, and at this stage in my life, I have stopped trying. What I know is this. Reeve put a shot into something on the 3rd of November, 1902, on the south fence of our property in Walworth County, Wisconsin. The something did not die. It came back. It came back with a measured, nightly advance that told us exactly what it was doing, that it was showing us what it could do before it decided what to do next. My father understood this before any of the rest of us did, and he was right. On the 5th night it came through the wall of the barn, not through the door that we had reinforced with iron brackets, not through the main opening, but through the wall itself, through the planking, because a door was something a man could secure, and a wall was something it could open. It looked at my father through the gap it made, and my father looked back, and then it left, and the following morning we fled, and I left Thomas in the grain store. I made myself get onto that wagon. My father told me once, years later, that I should not carry it the way I was carrying it, that the decision was his and not mine, that he was the father and the head of the household, and that the instruction was his instruction. He said this kindly, and I understood that he needed to say it, and I let him say it. It did not change what I carry, because I knew Thomas's voice in the dark when I heard it. I heard it call my name, and I got onto the wagon. My father made the decision, but I executed it. There is a difference, and I know the difference. Thomas died in 1931. He was 45 years old. The institution records, which my daughter obtained some years ago, state the cause as heart failure, which may be accurate, and list his condition as chronic undifferentiated psychosis, with periodic episodes of acute catatonia, which is the medical vocabulary of the time, for a man who has looked through a knothole at something that rearranged the inside of his mind so thoroughly that no subsequent experience could properly compete with it. I am 57 years past this. I am in a hospital bed in February of 1959, and the doctor has told me what he has told me, and my daughter has brought me this machine, and I have told it into this machine because Thomas never spoke, and my father is long dead, and Reeve died in 1944, and Hollis Prager died in 1937, and my mother died in 1921, and Clara died in 1952, and there is no one left who was there, except me. The marks on it are at 7 feet. Anyone who goes there will find it. I drove away from my brother's voice, and I have been driving away from it in one form or another every night since, in the half-sleep that is the closest I can get to real rest, in the particular quality of silence that a room has at 4 in the morning when the world outside is completely still and you are waiting for a sound that is going to come closer. What I am least able to account for, when I try to account for all of it, is not the fence post. It is not what came through the barn wall. It is the sound of the reins when my father shook them, a sound I can hear with perfect clarity right now, in this hospital room, in 1959. Leather on a cold horse's back, a horse taking the weight of the traces, the wagon beginning to move, and Thomas, behind us, still inside the latch. I drove away from that sound for 57 years, and I am done driving now. I want whoever hears this to know the fence post is there. I want them to know what it means, and I want them to know that whatever is in the cold stand along Bray Road did not invite us to test it. We did that ourselves, and the cost of it was not mine to pay. That is all I have.